Episode 24, Rural Industry, Colonial Markets, and New Economic Ideas, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Once and Future Present. Last episode, Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo helped us work through the agricultural revolution and Europe's huge population growth during the 18th century. Today, we're picking up where that story left off. We're going to look at how Europe's economy started changing in ways that eventually helped lead toward industrialization. We'll be talking about rural industry, Atlantic trade, colonial markets, slavery, and some new economic ideas that challenged older systems. Dr. Morgan, welcome back.
Glad to be here, Miles. Today's episode is really about scale. Europe's economy becomes larger, more connected, and increasingly global during the 18th century.
And Professor Theo is here too.
Good to be back, Miles. One thing students sometimes miss is that these economic changes also transformed daily life. People worked differently, bought different things, and started thinking differently about wealth and consumption.
So last episode we talked about how more food production helped Europe's population grow. Today is more about what happened after that population growth?
Exactly. More people meant larger markets, more laborers, and more demand for goods. European economies began expanding rapidly to meet that demand.
When I hear the phrase industrial revolution, I immediately picture factories with smokestacks and machines. But this chapter starts before that.
Right. Before large factories dominated production, Europe experienced what historians often call proto-industrialization. The prefix proto means before or early. So, proto-industrialization refers to the early forms of industrial production that developed before the full industrial revolution.
So this is kind of like a transition stage?
Exactly. And it developed partly because older systems of production could no longer keep up with demand. In many European cities, production had traditionally been controlled by guilds.
We've talked about guilds before, but can you remind us what they were?
Guilds were organizations of skilled workers or artisans that regulated production in towns and cities. They controlled prices, training, quality standards, and who could legally produce certain goods.
So kind of like a combination of a business association and a labor organization?
That's a reasonable comparison.
Guilds helped maintain quality, but they also limited expansion. Merchants who wanted to produce larger quantities of goods often found guild regulations restrictive.
Because guilds wanted to protect their members?
Exactly. But during the 18th century, demand for goods increased dramatically. More Europeans could afford textiles, household items, and imported goods than before.
So merchants began looking outside cities for labor.
And that's where the countryside comes in.
Right? Merchants developed what historians call the putting out system.
The basic idea was that merchants would put out raw materials to rural households. Families would spin thread, weave cloth, or perform other manufacturing tasks inside their homes.
Then the merchant would return later, collect the finished goods, and pay the family for their labor.
So instead of workers going to a factory, the work came to them. Was this already industrialization, or was it something different?
It was different. Production was still decentralized. People worked in homes rather than factories, and production still depended heavily on family labor rather than machines.
But historians see proto-industrialization as an important bridge between traditional agriculture and the later factory system.
Why did merchants prefer this system?
Several reasons. Rural labor was often cheaper than urban labor. Merchants could avoid guild regulations, and rural families were usually eager for extra income.
Especially during seasons when agricultural work slowed down.
So farming families might spend part of the year making textiles?
Exactly. Household economies became increasingly mixed. A family might farm, spin thread, weave cloth, and raise animals all at the same time. Proto-industrialization increased production, but it also increased workloads.
And it tied rural communities more closely to distant markets.
Meaning people in a village might suddenly be producing goods for customers they would never meet.
Exactly. This also changed family dynamics. Women and children played major roles in textile production.
So this wasn't just men doing the work.
Not at all. In many households, women performed spinning while men handled heavier agricultural labor. Children also contributed.
Was this seen as an opportunity or exploitation?
Both, depending on the situation. Some families appreciated the additional income. Others became trapped in cycles of low wages and constant labor.
And merchants benefited enormously because they controlled distribution and profits.
So the people actually making the goods didn't necessarily become wealthy.
Usually not.
This honestly sounds a little modern, almost like subcontracting or gig work where companies organize production through people working from home.
That's actually a useful comparison.
Did proto-industrialization happen everywhere in Europe?
No. Some regions industrialized more rapidly than others. Britain and parts of the Low Countries were especially important.
Textile production became particularly significant.
If you visit northern England today, you can still see some of the towns that later became centers of industrial textile production. When I took students to Manchester a few years ago, we walked through former mill districts that grew out of these earlier rural textile networks.
So these small rural production systems eventually helped create industrial cities.
Exactly.
Okay, so Europe is producing more goods, but the chapter also talks a lot about overseas trade.
Because European economies were no longer just local or even continental. By the 18th century, Europe was deeply connected to global trade networks.
Especially Atlantic trade.
Right. The Atlantic economy linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas through expanding systems of trade, shipping, labor, and empire.
And these trade networks transformed European consumption.
Meaning people started buying different things?
Exactly. Goods that had once been luxuries became increasingly common.
Like what?
Sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco, cotton textiles, and porcelain.
It's weird to think about tea being a luxury item.
Trade helped create enormous commercial wealth. Atlantic port cities expanded rapidly during the 18th century.
Which cities became the major centers?
London became the dominant commercial center in Britain. Liverpool grew wealthy through Atlantic trade. Amsterdam remained a major financial hub. Bordeaux became deeply tied to colonial commerce.
Why did Atlantic ports become so wealthy so quickly?
Because Atlantic trade connected Europe to plantation economies in the Americas. European merchants profited from shipping, banking, insurance, and colonial trade.
So there were a lot of different layers making money.
Exactly. And this growing trade contributed to what historians often call the consumer revolution.
What does that mean exactly?
It refers to the expansion of consumer culture during the 18th century. More Europeans began purchasing goods they did not strictly need for survival.
So consumption became part of social identity.
Very much so.
Tea drinking is a good example. Tea became associated with politeness, refinement, and middle-class respectability.
Historical habits often stop feeling strange once they become ordinary.
Did stores start changing too?
Yes. Shops displayed goods more visibly. Advertising expanded. Shopping itself became more socially important.
So people were increasingly buying things because they wanted them, not just because they needed them. That feels incredibly modern too.
In many ways, this period marks the beginning of modern consumer culture.
And imported goods became symbols of status.
Owning imported sugar or porcelain communicated wealth and sophistication.
But all of this depended heavily on colonial systems.
It did,
The chapter really connects European economic growth to slavery.
because the connection was extremely important. Plantation economies in the Americas produced enormous quantities of sugar, tobacco, and other cash crops for European markets.
And plantations relied on enslaved labor.
Brutally so.
The transatlantic slave trade expanded dramatically during the 18th century. European traders transported millions of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic.
The Middle Passage.
Yes. Conditions aboard slave ships were horrific. Overcrowding, disease, violence, and high death rates were common.
Why did slavery become so connected to sugar production specifically?
Sugar cultivation was extremely labor-intensive. Plantation owners wanted large labor forces that they could control completely.
And European demand for sugar kept rising.
So the consumer revolution and slavery were directly connected.
Exactly.
Historians often describe this system using the phrase triangular trade.
That's the trade network between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, right?
Correct. European goods were shipped to Africa. Enslaved Africans were transported to the Americas. Plantation products like sugar and tobacco were shipped back to Europe.
Did ordinary Europeans understand how connected their daily lives were to slavery?
Some certainly did. Others probably did not fully think about where these goods came from.
That also feels modern because people today buy products through global supply chains without always thinking much about labor conditions.
That's a fair comparison.
The Atlantic economy also stimulated financial development.
What do you mean?
Banks expanded, insurance companies grew, investors financed overseas ventures, commercial capitalism became increasingly sophisticated.
So this is part of what historians mean by the financial revolution?
Exactly. Britain, in particular, developed new financial institutions that made it easier for governments and merchants to borrow and invest money. One of the most important examples was the Bank of England, founded in 1694.
What made the Bank of England such a big deal?
It allowed the British government to borrow large amounts of capital more efficiently, especially during wartime. Instead of relying only on immediate tax revenue, the government could borrow money and repay it over time.
Which gave Britain an enormous advantage during long conflicts in the 18th century.
So Britain could basically finance wars in the short term by borrowing money?
Precisely. Historians sometimes call this the fiscal military state. Britain developed a financial system that helped support both commercial expansion and military expansion.
That actually connects back to Chapter 15 and all the stuff about states centralizing power.
Exactly, Miles. Earlier, we talked about rulers building larger bureaucracies, tax systems, and standing armies. The financial revolution added another layer to that process. Governments like Britain's could now borrow huge amounts of money and mobilize resources much more efficiently.
So state power wasn't just about kings or armies anymore. It was also about financial systems.
So trade, banking, empire, and warfare were all connected together.
Very much so. Atlantic trade generated wealth, and financial institutions helped governments mobilize that wealth for imperial competition.
So slavery wasn't just connected to plantations.
Correct. Many sectors of the European economy became tied to Atlantic commerce and the profits generated by slavery.
This is one reason historians continue debating how central slavery was to the rise of European capitalism.
Which is setting us up for next episode. Did people criticize slavery during this period?
Some did. Enlightenment thinkers increasingly discussed ideas about liberty and natural rights.
Which seems contradictory.
Very contradictory.
European societies were simultaneously expanding conversations about freedom while profiting from systems of coercion and enslavement.
That tension feels like one of the major themes of this period.
I think that's absolutely true.
The chapter ends by shifting into economic theory.
Because governments and intellectuals were trying to understand how wealth actually worked.
The older system was mercantilism.
Correct. Mercantilism argued that governments should tightly regulate trade in order to increase national wealth and power.
This is the idea that wealth was basically finite.
Exactly. Mercantilists believed one country's gain often came at another country's expense.
So governments tried to export more than they imported.
Right? Mercantilists wanted a favorable balance of trade.
Meaning more money flowing into the country than out.
Colonies played a major role in this system.
Because they supplied raw materials and bought manufactured goods. Why did governments think trade had winners and losers instead of everyone benefiting?
Partly because precious metals like gold and silver were treated as the foundation of wealth. Mercantilists often assumed there was only a limited amount of wealth available globally.
So economic competition between states became really intense.
Very much so.
But Enlightenment thinking also influenced economics.
Meaning people started trying to apply reason and natural laws to economies. Which leads us to Adam Smith.
Right? Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776.
That date feels important for multiple reasons.
Smith argued that economies worked more efficiently when individuals pursued their own self-interest within relatively free markets.
This is where we get the invisible hand idea. Did Adam Smith support capitalism exactly the way people talk about it today?
Not necessarily. Modern political debates often simplify Smith's ideas.
Smith did support freer markets compared to mercantilist systems, but he was not arguing that governments should disappear completely.
So laissez-faire doesn't mean literally no government.
Exactly. Smith was also interested in moral philosophy and social stability.
The chapter also mentions division of labor.
Smith argued that productivity increased when workers specialized in particular tasks.
Which sounds a lot like what industrial factories eventually do.
And this is why historians see these 18th century developments as laying foundations for industrialization.
So even though Europe hasn't fully industrialized yet, we can already see pieces of the Industrial Revolution starting to form.
Precisely.
Let's wrap this together.
During the 18th century, Europe's economy became increasingly interconnected and global. Rural industry expanded production, Atlantic trade generated enormous wealth, and commercial capitalism grew more sophisticated.
But these economic changes also transformed everyday life. Families worked differently, consumer culture expanded, and European prosperity became deeply connected to colonial exploitation and enslaved labor.
And Enlightenment thinkers started rethinking how economies actually functioned. So today we looked at how proto-industrialization expanded production, how colonial trade fueled European consumption, how slavery became deeply tied to Atlantic economies, and how thinkers like Adam Smith challenged older economic systems. Next episode, we're going to move into a historiographical debate that builds directly on today's topic. Was the West African slave trade a precondition for the rise of British capitalism?
That should be a lively conversation.
Definitely.
Thanks for listening to the Once and Future Present. We'll see you next time.